And it's often that it's the carbohydrate intake which is tied to their energy needs.
Yeah.
Fat intake in theory should be, you know, relatively static, as with protein intake as well. You know, having a higher protein intake for someone on an intensive training program is just as important on their rest days as it is on their training days to kind of optimize, you know, recovery.
So welcome today to another episode of Ask Lattice. Today it's me, Coach Josh, and I've got Ed Smith over here too. Ed is a nutritionist working on his PhD. He's worked with a range of athletes in nutrition, but he's also got a big background in strength and conditioning and calisthenics. So stick around today because I'm going to get into a lot about nutrition, but also strength training. Okay, so Ed, first question I've got for you. And this is a bit of a personal one for me because I think it's an interesting one. Bananas or Haribo?
Oh, that is a good question, to be fair.
So to put context into this, this is about crag snacks. And I think we all kind of know carbohydrates, sugar is like, it's an ergogenic aid, right? It kind of supports performance. It's good to eat at the crag or before your training session. But is there a difference between eating fruit, or can I just have like jelly babies, Haribo? What's better?
So I guess, I mean, if you're considering it from a nutrient perspective, the banana is going to come out on top. I mean, hands down. You know, obviously it's a source of carbohydrates, which are important, but as well as some electrolytes and other important vitamins and things that are going to support general health. You know, that said, there's probably a time and a place where you're going to want Haribo as well. Like, for example, if you're, you know, on a big wall, it might not be that practical to carry a bunch of bananas with you, whereas you could shove some, some like jelly babies or sweets, for example, in like your chalk bag or off your harness or something like that you can use. Another good example would be, you know, in various like temperatures. You know, how appealing is a banana going to be? Yeah. You know, if it's been sat baking in the sunlight, you know, like a day like today, for example. So yeah, essentially there's a time and a place for both, but I'd say the banana is going to come out on top in the vast majority of situations.
Okay, yeah, but you can't shove a banana in your chalk bag while you're on a big wall.
No, well.
So, okay, it's just a practical one then. So I'm voting jelly babies or Haribo. You're voting banana?
I'm voting banana, yeah, 90% of the time, but yeah, I'm partial to some sweeter treats as well.
Comments below. What's your favourite crag snack? Okay, so the next one is maybe a tricky one, but I want you to pick one sort of behaviour or habit. Perhaps you see climbers doing this already, but behaviour or habit you would change for most people, which would improve their nutrition on a sort of day-to-day basis.
Okay, so I guess people are very, very kind of hung up on the whole kind of weight relative aspect of climbing performance. Yeah. And, you know, whilst it's important, and obviously it's going to be important for any high level athlete not to be gaining excess fat, you know, especially if this was kind of over the long term.
Sort of remaining athletic.
Yeah, exactly. You want to stay in good shape, but one of the traits that I do generally see is that people try and stay in peak shape all of the time. Okay. And by doing so, they might actually be limiting their dietary intake to the point where it could be having an influence on things like training recovery and adaptation. So I would say that, you know, a piece of advice would be to perhaps, when you are going through stages in your training where maximise adaptation is of utmost importance, perhaps have taken a less restrictive approach on the diet. Like I said, I mean, people trying to achieve this constant energy balance, and you know, we simply cannot do that. You know, short of going around with, you know, a gas analyzer on your back all day long or doing all your training in a metabolic chamber, you're just not going to be able to achieve energy balance all the time. Now, for a lot of people, they'll think, well, as long as I'm not gaining weight, you know, that's obviously of benefit to me. When in reality, having that little bit of a surplus at certain points of the year, of course, might actually be beneficial in terms of promoting adaptation. And it also ensures that the athlete is then not under eating. Okay. So it's almost like, I would say that, you know, be kind of cautious of not chronically under fueling in a pursuit just to maintain an ideal body composition.
Yep.
And I did mention this on a recent post that I think it's fairly plausible to allow maybe a 5% increase in the in a person's kind of off season, whatever that might look like, because obviously it's a little bit different for a person who projects routes in the summer, or boulder on grit in the winter, or then even your competition athletes who have got that competition season to bear in mind as well. Yeah, I mean, you do see that it's quite the norm in other sports.
Yep.
But in climbing, there's this attitude that I just must perform at my best all year round.
So we're saying it's about periodizing your nutritional intake to the same kind of flow as your training. So if you've got a base season, that's when you're saying we can sort of look for an increase of weight along with the probably increase in training volume as well.
Exactly. So you're not necessarily aiming for an increase in weight, but rather allowing it, to some extent, with the knowledge that as long as you're not creeping too far away from what you believe to be, an ideal, performance peak, there will always be opportunity to bring it back.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So it doesn't have to be this constant day-to-day consideration. If your focus is on more towards how can I best recover, how can I best fuel this training session to get the highest quality out of it, they should really be the priorities. And then body composition should really be an afterthought or the final piece to the puzzle, as you're trying to perhaps aim for a performance peak.
So with that in mind, I'm approaching my peak season. I've allowed my weight to creep up a little bit because I've wanted to prioritize my recovery and my training for my base season. So now I'm approaching my peak, and I get this question quite a lot. Like, I kind of want to start cutting weight now. My peak season's coming up. How do I do this? What's the best method? Do you have some go-to rules, like a certain amount of calories you might restrict per day, or a sort of speed at which you can drop weight?
So it's important to acknowledge that every individual is different, and everyone does respond to an energy deficit differently. For some people, dropping the weight significantly, dropping the energy intake significantly almost immediately leads to cravings or feeling underfueled, feeling tired, can dampen the immune system, that kind of thing, where other individuals seem to operate absolutely fine on, say, 1,000 calorie deficit for a short period of time.
Yeah.
So, experience does play a role there for sure. I would always operate on the cautious side of things and probably not go beyond a 500 calorie daily deficit.
Yeah.
But again, it depends how far away you are from your kind of target body composition or target weight. If you are very close and you're looking at a very small margin, then for some individuals, it might actually be better to try and condense it within quite an acute period.
Okay.
So that might mean, trying to ensure that you're still hitting your pre and post kind of nutritional strategies in terms of carbohydrate availability beforehand, and then recovery, and making sure that you're getting regular protein and things like that. But then perhaps on those less active days, so if you've got a rest day, again, there's caveats to this, of course, if you're training intensely the following day, but perhaps then considering having a larger deficit on those days, which might facilitate a faster rate of body fat. But I mean, I guess it always does come down to, the rate of fat that your body can actually oxidize in a given day. There is an upper limit on this, and by losing weight more slowly or having that smaller energy deficit over a greater period of time, it helps the body to preserve the muscle mass.
Yeah. Okay.
And obviously, to some extent, your training output. So, I mean, I would always say that you are probably better aiming to implement a energy deficit when you're at a maintenance point in your training, or you're not looking to, push performance much higher than where you're at currently.
Okay.
That's probably the best piece of advice I have. I see a lot of people trying to kind of burn the candles at both ends, in that they want to get the best out of their training.
With that in mind, through a maintenance phase, this might be someone's in-season time. So we're not talking about approaching the peak as such. Say someone's got a 3-month period where the conditions are best. We might do it in that 3-month period. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Because ultimately, when you are training hard and you're looking to, induce adaptations in the body, there's an energy cost to doing so. Now, if you're depriving your body of the energy that it needs to do that, then in many ways you're kind of sabotaging your training program. I mean, of course, there are cases, perhaps of people that are new to the sport that are looking to kind of optimize body composition, you know, for performance as well as, I guess, making progress as well in some of the maybe strength parameters or capacity parameters and things like that. But then again, there's a greater magnitude to do so, if that makes sense. You know, for an elite athlete, it's a lot harder to make training gains.
Yeah.
Whereas it's a lot
closer to the upper limit.
Exactly.
Their genetic potential. Yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, it's also important to acknowledge that, you know, as I said before, there's an energy cost to trying to adapt, and the more strenuous your training is, basically, the more muscle damage there is, the higher your recovery needs are potentially going to be as well. So that's why, you know, tackling any changes in body composition is probably more appropriate at a maintenance phase, because you're not damaging your body as much.
Yeah.
So you're probably in a better place to do that.
I suppose some people might be worried that in that maintenance phase, that's probably also when they're trying to perform. So they might be training less, which is why we can probably be in that calorie deficit. But what if people are concerned about sabotaging their performance on the days they train? Is there something you might do in that peak period? I think you mentioned even in a base period, you might be restricting the calories more on the days you're not climbing. Is that something you'd also take through to the peak period?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, right in the peak period is probably not the best time to have an energy deficit altogether, to be honest. I would say that if there is only a very small target of change, let's say you wanted to drop maybe 1 to 2 kilos before a trip, then you are probably better doing that once you've maximised adaptation from training, and then perhaps as you begin to kind of taper off the volume just before the trip.
And you mentioned this being like the acute period. How long is this acute period for someone that, say, is dropping 1 to 2 kilos?
I mean, realistically, that could be as little as 1 to 2 weeks for some individuals. Again, like I said there, I would never work with someone who is, you know, an elite athlete looking to, you know, perhaps break a plateau in their performance and go out and essentially, you know, red point the hardest route they've ever done. And say, oh, okay, we're going to try and get you to lose 1 to 2 kilos in the week before or the 2 weeks before, because that, you know, in many ways may work against you. But there's lots of considerations around that. I mean, I've mentioned, you know, an acceptable rate of weight loss, and even for an acute period, but you've got to kind of weigh up actually how big of an impact will that have on your climbing performance. I mean, anybody knows that's, you know, that's been following a training program for some time will know there's a fair degree of variability in day-to-day testing anyway, and in fact quite a large degree in you know, weight day-to-day as well. And this can vary massively for individuals. Exactly. You know, some people will see like 1 to 2 kilos from any other day, and if we're talking about losing that much weight, you know, and that's also your variability day-to-day, that's quite a big difference. So this is the thing, you've got to kind of have that conversation with yourself as to whether or not, am I going to see a significant benefit of losing 1 to 2 kilos before my trip? Now, if the answer is yes, well, then that's when it becomes a consideration as to, well, how's the best way to approach this? If you think, well, actually, you know, there's scope for me to improve my max hangs by 1 to 2% by doing some recruitment work leading up to the trip, then
that's the higher priority then.
Exactly, Why not be stronger rather than lighter? So there's definitely, you know, a context to the situation, and that will vary for individuals as to how far away they are from their physiological performance peak and what the scope is for body composition change.
So I think we could probably summarize that with, it's important to periodize your nutrition along with your training, right? And that's kind of going to depend on your training load. So we're probably looking at a higher calorie intake during our base period or our off season. And then it's fair to say sort of no more than 500 calories a day for average, most people?
Yeah, I'd say for most people 500 calories a day should be the kind of upper limit really.
Yeah, and then the length of period, if you are cutting weight for a peak season, probably depends on the amount of weight you're looking to lose, right? So
exactly,
we've got that acute period, which is variable between the individual.
Yeah,
cool.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, really interesting. Okay, so right, my next one was actually, what does a nutrition plan look like? What is a nutrition plan? So I think for most people, they understand what a training plan looks like. It's normally adding something to their training week, or it's modifying their current climbing sessions. But what does a nutrition plan look like? Is it meal plans? Are you talking to me about my macros? Do you tell me what supplements I should be taking?
Yeah, so it really depends on the level of support that an individual is looking for. And the process of working with someone from a nutritional perspective is not that dissimilar from training.
Yeah.
So there's an element of assessment. It's finding out what the individual's needs are, having a look at dietary intake and perhaps highlighting areas where there are low-hanging fruit. You know, is there parts of this diet that you feel could be optimized relatively simply? Is a person perhaps, you know, under fueling potentially, but their diet composition is very good. You know, they are getting a nice range of you know, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, rich source of omega-3. It's just that little bit too low.
Yeah.
And that you know, the advice might be pretty straightforward in that just generally increasing portion sizes overall could be the simple answer.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, it does come down to dialing in their nutrition around kind of training, meeting training needs, and often that's where people fall short, especially when they consider their general day-to-day needs from an occupational point of view, and then physical activity outside of climbing and training. So, I mean, that's really the kind of basis of a nutrition plan, is highlighting areas where there is room for improvement.
Yep.
Okay, perhaps making some recommendations based on that, and then really delving into, okay, what's their training load like? How does this change over time? So with our kind of performance-based nutrition plans, we do exactly that. If a person is on a Lattice nutrition plan, then we know exactly what sessions they will have planned pretty much week to week.
Yeah.
In fact, we do know that from week to week very precisely. So let's say it's a 12-week period. We can say, well, we know the kind of the loading effect of doing this type of training, and then we can start to apply this to their kind of overall energy needs.
So it's a balancing act. You're looking at both sides of the scale here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So obviously the training part of things plays a very important role in informing what their nutritional requirements might look like. And we take kind of two approaches, one of which is to say, well, this is how your training is periodized on a week-to-week basis. You know, quite typically we see that a person might have three weeks of quite, you know, intense loading, followed by a deload week, and this might repeat in a cycle. So we can say, well, okay, these are the weeks where your energy requirements are definitely going to be higher, and these are where they're perhaps going to be a little bit lower. But then we can take one step further as well and start to look at it from a day-to-day periodized perspective.
Yeah.
Because even within quite a high training load week, there's still going to be rest days. And
so this is where we come to the idea of fueling your training, and actually how that will vary from day to day. So yeah. I'm right in saying that you're probably going to give recommendations around what they eat before a training session.
Yes.
And after a training session.
Exactly,
and then that's
yeah.
going to look different to a day when they're not training, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And it's often it's the carbohydrate intake which is tied to their energy needs.
Yeah.
Fat intake in theory should be, you know, relatively static, as with protein intake as well. You know,
okay.
Having a higher protein intake for someone on an intensive training program is just as important on their rest days as it is on their training days, yep. to kind of optimize, you know, recovery. But carbohydrates, for example, this is where we can either reduce and kind of taper back energy intake, and then perhaps boost it on those days where it's you know, more relevant.
Yep.
And particularly for a lot of people, which I'm seeing now, are, you know, they're climbing at a high level, but they're also doing a fair bit of activity on the side as well. And it might be that they do some feld running or some cycling, rowing, that kind of stuff. And you know, and I had this conversation with somebody quite recently, it's perspectives of what a rest day is.
Yes.
You know, so for some people a rest day is just, well, I'm not climbing and I'm not doing climbing training, and therefore this is a rest day.
But I've got a yoga class and I'm going running, and I'm taking a dog for a walk, and
Exactly, yeah. So these things have got to be considered amongst that as well. And that's why it's really important to have a very kind of open and honest dialogue, obviously with the client and with the practitioner, as to what that looks like. Because it's all well and good saying, well, here's my lattice training plan, this is what I'm following. But in actual fact, you know, some of those kind of rest days from a climbing perspective might actually require higher energy demands than some of the intense training days. So yeah, it's a really kind of detailed look at a person's training load, and then trying to tailor the nutrition around that. But
how do I receive it from the person being given the plan? Am I told that I need to eat so many carbohydrates in this meal, and how many meals a day am I eating? Is it just the standard 3, or do you give recommendations around what I'm actually putting on the table? Yeah,
so we try not to we try not to basically cookie cut, which is what a lot of kind of online training coaches will do. They'll say, well, here's your energy requirements, and this is what this looks like as a diet plan, with no real thought as to what that person's nutritional preferences are, and with no real thought as to what that person is going to do when they've consumed that meal plan every day for 6 weeks in a row. You know, it has to come to an end at some point. So what we do is we say, well, these are your nutritional targets, okay? Give them a good understanding of how that is tapered up and down depending on energy needs from both a day-to-day perspective, but also week to week, depending on the overall load. But then also some examples. So if I've said to somebody, well, I want you to hit 60 grams of carbohydrate with your breakfast, 20 to 30 grams of protein, and 20 grams of fat, and that's all well and good, and some people will take that and go, that's great, I know exactly how to translate that. But we give guidance on translating energy and macronutrient targets into nutrition, so what those portions might look like, but also an example kind of meal plan.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, to me it sounds very much more guided than prescriptive in that sense, which means you can interpret it, like you're saying, in your own way, depending on your nutritional preference. And you can take it in that direction. Is that right? Fair to say?
Yeah, I suppose there's, you know, people do have very different needs. You know, say an omnivore versus a vegan, you know, to achieve the same protein intake is going to take a very, very different approach. And for some people, obviously, they'll need a little bit more insight as to what that looks like as food, and that's why we do provide that. But it's as much as an educational process as it is a prescriptive one. We want people to understand why we're telling them to do what we're doing, and also, you know, we want people to at some point be able to be, you know, self-sufficient and be able to, you know, with a greater understanding of nutrition and how things do change depending on their goals, what they can do in the future. And then, of course, the kind of consultation-based plans are all about supporting an individual in perhaps making their own choices. So that's why we have a few different products. Some people do prefer that more periodized approach of saying, well, okay, here are your, not strict daily targets, but here are your targets. And for some people, they prefer having that kind of check-in approach and saying, well, this is what I'm doing, how can I improve that? So there's different things work for different people.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it sounds really cool. It's like educational, it's about guiding and teaching the principles, and then being able to take that forward in your own way, and just, implement your own nutritional preferences, which is cool.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna ask you a question about your PhD. So Ed's currently studying a PhD, but this involves, I guess, many different parts, many studies, but you've recently published or put out some work that you've done around looking at nutritional intakes of climbers. Could you summarize the work you've done so far in your PhD?
Yeah, so essentially this particular paper you're referring to was looking at the dietary intake, body composition and iron status in climbers.
Can you teach me about what iron status is and why it's important?
So the reason why this was particularly relevant is because there's quite a lot of research in other sports where there's a weight-sensitive element to it that have found negative effects on a person's iron status. What I mean by iron status is have they got adequate iron stores in their body to maintain normal red blood cell production?
Yep.
And it's quite a useful marker of nutritional, I guess you'd say, sufficiency, because a person's overall energy intake is somewhat linked or tied to their micronutrient intake. I mean, not always, because a person can have a lot of energy and a bad diet, if that makes sense, or not necessarily a bad diet, but rather a low nutrient density diet.
Eating too many jelly babies
and vice versa. But there is this kind of back and forward link between low energy availability and low iron.
Okay.
And this has been seen consistently across decades of research in, as I said, sports that tend to be either weight relative or have like an aesthetic element to it.
Yeah.
So that's why that was of particular interest. And also, it's not been studied before in climbers. In fact, there's been very little research in nutrition and climbing, which is exactly my aim of the PhD, is to help fill that gap. So we had a reasonable number of participants. I think it was 40 participants, and they ranged in ability from advanced climbers all the way up to kind of higher elite. And we found kind of two main findings that I find quite interesting. Firstly, it was quite apparent that across the board, climbers tend to underfuel. Whilst we were unable to actually measure their energy output, that would be an unrealistic task. huge scale study required to be able to do that. We didn't follow them around day to day. But what we were able to do is estimate what their energy needs would look like if they were following a moderate training program. Now, it's important to note that the average training hours and climbing hours of this cohort were very high.
Yeah.
I mean, from memory, I think it was beyond 10 hours a week, and for some individuals, it was beyond 20, even up to 30.
This is like 20 to 30 hours in the gym or out climbing.
Yeah. So for this particular group of individuals, you'd really be looking at the higher end of, energy requirements for active individuals. Perhaps not within the realms of, endurance athletes, but certainly some of the sports with mixed energy system involvement.
Yep.
And so what we found is actually very nearly all these athletes, or at least 80% of them, were not actually meeting energy needs for a moderate training program, and yet they were training far beyond this. So we can say with some certainty that, even taking into account the expected margin of error of a study of this nature, so tracking diets and things like that can of course have a little bit of error in there. But even taking that into account, we can say with some certainty that the vast majority of these climbers were in fact underfueling.
So do you think this is representative of the climbing community as a whole? Is that we're probably, or there's probably a lot of us out there, which are underfueling for our training?
So this is, I think, a bit of an interesting analogy, is that obviously, having studied sports nutrition amongst other kind of world-class nutritionists in the world and seeing what they do, it's interesting to find that for some athletes or for some populations, nutritionists tend to say, well, we need to get your dietary intake under control for your sport. You're perhaps eating too much in certain areas. Whereas for climbing, I spend all my time telling people to eat more. It's like almost the opposite. And this is such a stark contrast, obviously, with the general population as well. We have an obesity issue in the country, and people see nutrition as, a nutritionist tells you how to diet, a nutritionist tells you how to control weight, a nutritionist tells you how to, get waist circumference down with an acceptable parameter, things like that. Whereas for me, I'm essentially doing the opposite. I'm saying this is how you should be looking to fuel yourself. These are the negative consequences of being underfueled, and so on. So yeah, basically.
Do you think we need to improve the education more, or the knowledge out there around nutrition within climbing? What do you think could help with this? I mean, you're already doing part of the work,
yeah,
you're on the ground floor, like
so
doing
as,
research.
As you'll know, like climbers are they're very data driven, you know, and that's why it's important to do things properly, you know, to study this in a robust manner and give people the hard facts, basically, the data that they can see. I think, you know, historically, there's been this a little bit of an ethos in climbing where, you know, training as hard as you can, you know, running yourself into the ground. You know, if you're not in pain after a session, you've not trained hard enough. And there's a lot, you see a lot of extremes, again, with the diet as well. You know, when I first got into climbing myself and exploring nutrition amongst climbers, as part of my postgraduate studies, I was gobsmacked listening to some of the nutritional practices that people were essentially reporting to me. I met with a number of local high performance climbers and some ex-GB athletes as well that say, you know, I know of people who have recommended, you know, blending broccoli and like just having all fluid diets and all these things that I was like, wow, you know what I mean? And and at the time, you know, I was doing my postgraduate study, so I'd not got a lot of experience as a practitioner under my belt. And for me, you know, I've obviously spent a few years at university and then studying through the IOC. I could see that, you know, even though there was not any strict guidelines out there for climbers, the importance of energy provision seemed obvious. It seemed really obvious to me. And then to have someone say to me, well, you know, I once dropped 5 kilograms in 2 weeks for a climbing trip, and I felt great for the first day and then not so much after that. I was thinking, well, obviously, you know, I was thinking surely, you know, but no, that's not the case, because all it takes is for somebody somewhere to have had success with a particular dietary strategy or intervention, and then that gets passed on then, and that becomes the evidence base for the sport.
Yeah.
And it was a very, very similar scenario in combat sports, say 10, 15 years ago. It was all about, okay, I'm going to follow suit with whatever my coach did when they were a successful athlete.
And they've got some pretty aggressive, like, weight loss strategies, haven't they, in that?
And, you know, and sure, there's going to be a very small percentage of people whose bodies will basically put up with whatever's thrown at them for a short period.
Yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, it tended to be that the nutritional advice was very much based on what successful athletes had done before them, rather than what a scientific consensus was. And that's what my aim with the PhD is to build up that scientific knowledge base.
Is there something we can do as climbers to get a handle on if we're eating enough? I've played around with like MyFitnessPal in the past and tracking calories, and I think that was quite enlightening just to see what I was eating in the day, how many calories I was eating, and what it was made up of, you know, like breaking down the macros of carbs, proteins, and fats. Is there something like that you'd recommend just so climbers could get an idea of what's going on?
Yes, I mean, dietary tracking for a short period of time can be useful. Like you said, in a way, it kind of calibrates in your mind what a particular, let's say you have a breakfast 5 days a week, what that actually looks like from a nutrient point of view.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to you know, to slip into habits. You know, in your mind, this is what a portion of something looks like, and then you track it and you think, oh, it's totally different from what I thought. And it can be quite eye-opening. You know, I do see intentional restriction in the diets of climbers, but I also see unintentional restriction as well. Some people will say, well, I don't feel like I'm making an effort to restrict, but actually I'm probably nowhere near what these optimal targets are. So to have a period of dietary tracking, I think can be useful.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is just kind of having a little bit of a play around with the diet as well.
Experiment.
Have a little bit of an experiment. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, for most people, I would probably suggest actually having a period of time where you increase overall energy intake, and that could just look like, as I said before, just increasing portion sizes of all the meals of the day, and perhaps if you're not already, making sure that you're having something before your training at the very least, and see how that makes you feel. See what effect that has on recovery, the training quality. Don't get hell-bent on tracking weight, but you know, monitoring weight perhaps on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis, and then just kind of going with the flow a little bit. You know, if you're finding there's benefit, you know, then stick with it, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. Just experiment. I think we do a lot in our training as well. See how a new session works out or something, and then when it works, it works.
Exactly.